Hi, good morning, folks. This is Jim Hodgson here at the Fun With Aviation Museum, home to the most touchable warbirds in Texas. I'm here with Garry Goff, and we're out here with the Air Force OV-10. And what we thought we would talk about today is instrument approaches, the variety of different kinds, and then how you would do. If I could get this camera to just stand still for just a second, we're going to talk a little bit about instrument approaches. You know, it's not magic that when you're bringing an airplane in, it doesn't make any difference whether it's an OV-10 like this or whether it's a 777 or a 73. It's all the same way. You're looking for a way to come into an airport on a specific heading and using different altitude markers to get yourself into a runway. And depending on how precise your instrumentation that you're working with is, you can go ahead and get down to what's referred to as a Cat 3 approach, which is 0-0. And we'll talk a little bit about those later on. But we're going to start out with some of the real basics. And Garry, why don't you show an approach chart?
This
what
every guy back in the 80s had. This is our purse that carried all of our maps and our checklists, emergency procedures, and also carried the most important thing, well, not really necessarily the most important, but especially if you had to get back to the runway when it's bad weather, is how do I land? How do I get to the runway so that I can land in the weather? And it's faded because this is 38 years old. And this is to Edwards Air Force Base.
And I'm just kind of scanning it here so people can get a view of what this is. This is a typical approach plate. And it'll tell you up at the top right-hand corner, and these are all standardized, and the military and civilians use the same thing. It'll tell you what the airport is, what the type of approach it is, what runway it goes to. It will show you a depiction of the direction of the courses that you want to fly. It will show you the radio navigation aids. It will also show you things like towers and the altitude of towers in the area, so you'll know what you've got to restrict. And now that's the horizontal view, but every one of these has also got a vertical view. So you're not only looking for a radial or a bearing or heading into the airport, but you're also looking for altitudes that you can step down. And down here at the bottom, it talks about categories and circling, and then this is going to give you some of the weather minimums. And then you got a small depiction of the airport itself. So you've got an idea of how the runways are laid out, because once you break out of the weather, if you're flying in the actual weather on these things, it's nice to know what you should be looking at when you finally do get to see that. So Garry, talk a little bit about getting set up for an approach and then how you would fly it.
The thing that everyone has to remember is that it's just me or Jim, and one of the reasons why we picked this airplane is both of us are instructors, and both of us know what it's like to be instructed and to instruct somebody to shoot an instrument approach. So it's just you, and this is how you fly. Right here is up, down, left, and right, and there's your power levers over there. So you're hand flying everything. There's no autopilot in these airplanes. And these little bitty instruments here are how we actually navigate. And here comes the video.
Come on, get back up there.
Come on, camera. It'll figure it out. There it is.
Okay,
all right.
There we go.
These little instruments here are what we navigate on. Now, instruments today are significantly bigger, especially in glass cockpit. But back in the 80s, when we were flying 70s and 80s, this is all you had. And this is the primary instrument. This is your attitude indicator. You can see the blue sky above and the black ground on the bottom. So you need to know how, and each one of them have little designation, little lines on there, so you know if you're 3 degrees above the horizon, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, whatnot. The other major instrument is this one, which is your heading and your navigational instrument. You can see there's two needles there, one for different navigations that you dial in over here on the side panel. So you have to dial in the frequency to be able to receive that, especially if it's a VOR, which stands for
VHF omnidirectional range.
So it's a VHF radio. Omnidirectional means 360 degrees, and range so we can figure out where we are and what we're doing. This nice little gadget right here is the primaries very early on ILS that we used to fly. And ILS stands for Instrument Landing
System.
There it is. I've been away for a while. And the vertical bar here shows you left or right, of course, and the horizontal bar shows you above or below glide path. And that was the most precise instrument flying that we had, was called an ILS, because it allowed you to be able to fly a glide path all the way down. And for us in the Air Force, it was 301. I don't know what you guys got to fly down to.
That was pretty much it. But you can see up at the top, you would dial in a course, and with the VHS and the VOR, which are the bearing and bearing into an airport, heading and bearing into an airport,
like airports
that
there.
would tell you specifically that that's the course you want to be on. So you would be left or right, and so you would steer to where you would have that thing in the center, so that you would be on and pointed at the appropriate airport.
What really made it advantageous for us flying this by ourselves in the night, in the weather, whatever it is when they came up with what's called a DME, or distance measuring equipment. And so not only did I know on what radial I was on from the navigation facility, typically they're at the airport, but I would also know the distance from the airport that I was, so I could fix myself very, very accurately on the map right here at this, whatever this range is here, to be able to start this approach into. So I knew I was right there, and I was flying in to land on the approach. I knew I was right here getting ready to come in. So the distance measuring equipment was a big, big bonus for those when we finally got them.
Well, then you've also got things like the climb and descent indicator, because you'd want to, once you got on your glide path, or you'd hit what's referred to as the outer marker and start in, you'd want to set a particular rate of descent that would bring you down on a glide slope at 2 or 3 degree,
which equates to about 650 to 700 feet per minute rate of descent.
So you'd be watching that. So you've got a scan going that you're hitting all of these instruments. You're looking at the all attitude indicator. You're watching your speed, because if your speed gets off by even 5 knots, you're gonna go high, or you're going to miss things. And then you've got the altimeter too. So you're looking at those instruments, sometimes referred to as the pilot's six pack.
Yes, I have heard that in so long. The six pack, yes.
But those are your primary instruments. Now, so we talk about this was fairly modern, or the way it was done when Garry and I were actively flying in the military. But even before, and you see these published charts by a company called Jeppesen, by the way. They started doing charts back in the 20s and 30s, because what happened back in those days is, and I saw some of the early ones that were done when people were flying out in the islands and things, is they would hand draw depictions of these approach plates, and they would pass them around amongst the pilots. And it was usually then it was a matter of, well, you fly until you get to this landmark, and then you take up a heading of 220 degrees, and you fly that for 2 miles, and then you come left, and then the airport's going to be, such and such, that kind of a thing. So there was no standardization. We come down to this era in the 70s and in the 80s, and even in the 90s, we were still using a lot of this stuff. Before we started using a lot of other electronic means, ILSs have become very commonplace, but then we started to get other ways of getting in. When the weather was really bad and you needed to get in for sure, we had 2 other ways. The Air Force used PAR approaches, which stand for
precision something.
Precision approach radar.
Yeah, what you said.
Yeah. And then in the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard, we used GCA, which is a ground controlled approach. But what you do is you would fly yourself to a point in space, and then a ground controller would guide you onto that heading or that bearing into the airport, and then you would start a descent, and they would monitor your descent. They'd tell you you're left or right, you're high or low.
Set above glide path.
Above glide
path.
On course.
On glide path.
That's what you wanted to hear.
Path. Yes. I mean, they were talking to you all the time. You'd be listening to this, because you have no way of knowing how to get into it. Say they don't have any of these approach things, and you keep wanting to hear on course, on glide path, on course, on glide path. That was a great feeling.
Well, and that's how you got aboard the boat, too, in the weather. You had LSOs, but they couldn't see a lot of times until you got up a lot closer. So those were precision, what we consider to be precision approaches, although by today's standards, they're certainly not. And then during my time in the airlines, and Garry's also, we started using what's referred to as RNAV, which is regional navigation. And that has become a true godsend on a lot of this stuff. We're going
to turn around and give it to Jim.
Yeah.
And he's going to show you, because the ILS that we had when I was flying an MD-80 was you could hook it up to the autopilot, and the aircraft would fly down and land the aircraft to 0 visibility. But Jim is going to show you something completely revolutionary.
I'm pulling up ForeFlight, which is, we've talked about this a little bit before, but ForeFlight gives me the ability to have everything that Garry has in this bag, plus a whole lot more.
A whole lot more.
All right here. Now, as it's starting to come in, what you're seeing here is I've got a split screen, and I'm going to go off split here for a second. So here's the, we talked about this a little bit. Here's the area map that gets me into a place, for instance, like here at Meacham Field. So I'm going to go to Meacham, and then I've got all of the different procedures. I can go into procedures, airport, departures, arrivals, and approaches. So we're going to take a look at the ILS, or localizer to runway 16. Oop, hit the wrong one. That doesn't make any difference. It's still going to come up.
It's still going to come up.
But here you go, and this is what we look at today. You will notice
a similarity.
They are virtually identical. I mean, it's different airports, but they are virtually identical because they have been so ingrained into the pilots. But this is electronically. It's got all of the same information, but you can now fly it off of one of these. This is an iPad. You can fly them off of any number of different things. So then we can go back to, depending on how you're set up, hit it twice.
There you go. You're back.
Okay. So we can do a split screen on this, so where you've got the map on the bottom.
That's nice.
And up on the top, it's almost like a HUD, which is giving you direction, and it's giving you altitude and airspeed. Of course, we're standing here in one place, and so we're not seeing much. But this is a lot like what we're seeing in the cockpits on the 777s and the 78s and the Airbuses and everything else. You still have the ability to be able to get your horizontal and vertical association with the approach that you want to fly. And although it's all built in. Now, one of the things that's nice is that with all of these approaches that we've talked about, you had to have a ground station of some sort. You had to have contact with a ground station on the ground, so that there was an interrogation going on between the airplane and the ground stations.
And the maintenance involved in maintaining the ILS systems and all that stuff. Oh my gosh!
I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But now we have the ability in the airplanes that, as long as you've got the database in the airplane and as long as you've got a GPS that works, you can either build your own approach, or there's approaches that are available to you that still look like this, except you're not tied to the ground at all. You fly the approach, and in fact, it makes it easier to get into some places that may have not just a straight in approach, but it may have a portion where you're actually following a river until you get to a place where you actually hook into,
or like going into Tegucigalpa or any of these other places where you got to go around a mountain type thing to be able to get into the valley to allow you to get into land on it. And it used to be like an arc approach, but the problem is if you got too low, the mountains block the signal.
Yes.
So now you got to go missed approach, which is always a scary thing. So by having this type of technology, as long as you can see a satellite, as long as you got GPS, dude, you can go anywhere.
And this isn't. This doesn't just. It is not just involved with the approaches itself. But procedures. We're going to look at procedures, and let's look at arrival procedures. This is wrong airport.
And the good news about why Jim's pulling this up is that you notice that everything he needs is in this iPad, versus this is where I had to keep all the paperwork, all the checklists, everything I had just to fly a fighter. Now imagine carrying in a big airline the books that you have to carry. I remember they were called kit bags, and they were weighed a ton, whereas now everything's in this nice little iPad, and it's so convenient, so easy to find stuff, search in there. Whoa,
and
look at that arrival.
And here's this is an arrival into Fort Worth, into Meacham Field. and it doesn't want to lock for me. So I'm going to try to hold it. It's not
going to do it.
But what the point with these arrivals are, you don't just fly over to the airport and start to shoot the approach. With all of these airports, there are different approach fixes that you have to come through, gates and things like that, as they're referred to. As you're flying in, you're coming down from altitude, you're under control, and they're going to tell you to fly to the Doxy 6 arrival. And so you pull up that pad, whether it's paper or whether it's electronic, and you can plug it in and you can fly that Doxy approach, which gets you into the airport area so that you can then be metered in to do the approach to the
and these
to the
arrivals
airport.
could start hundreds of miles away from the airport, and it usually gives you a point and an altitude to be at, so that you can arrive in while they have just as much traffic leaving out. And so it all deconflicts, because you're supposed to be at this altitude at this fix coming down, versus the guys going out have got to be at that certain fix at a much higher altitude. And so it's all deconflicted, and the aircraft can come in safely and arrive into a airport, into a busy airport like where there's LaGuardia or DFW or anything. Right. Reno, good Lord, Reno's always busy.
And I'm pulling up another one. It's not coming right up, but in addition to the arrivals, there are departures. Here we go. This is a departure. It's called the, whoops, it did it again. It's called, well, I'm not going to put it up. It looks a lot like the arrivals, but it's called a departure. And so the controllers will tell you you're going to take off on certain runway, and you're going to use the Garland 8 departure with a transition at whatever it might happen to be, which means you're going to fly that approach to get out of a busy area to where you can then connect to the en route system and get up airborne and go on your way. So we go from these paper things to where people were making them by hand and sharing them, to where we got standardized with them, used them for years and years and years in paper things. And it was one of the banes of the airline pilot, is every time you'd go in to fly, you'd have a big envelope full of changes. Yes. And sometimes it was airports you didn't even go to, but you had to have the appropriate changes in there.
Yes.
Because you never knew what it was.
You have to divert there.
You'd have to divert, something like that. It might be an altitude deal or something. But now to talk briefly about what a Cat 3 approach is. There's Category 1, 2, and 3 approaches.
Yeah.
And the Category 3 approach is something that was built up over the last probably 20 years. I don't know if it's much older than 20 years. But a Category 3 approach means that I can bring an airliner into an airport with zero visibility. I can have no ceiling, I can have no visibility, and I can safely bring the airplane in. That isn't because I'm a great aviator with steely eyes and brave.
No.
It means that, first of all, the airplane has certain systems on board it. Second of all, the ground has certain systems available to it. And third of all, Garry and I as a crew would have been trained to use all of that and would be proficient. So you use a concept that's referred to as a quiet cockpit, so that once you get down below 18 or 10,000 feet, depending on the procedure, there's no comments made in the cockpit except those that are procedurally correct. It's going to be things like continue, it's going to be things like go around. So anything else becomes a distraction. So you're flying these, and you have a flying pilot and a monitoring pilot. So one pilot is going to be monitoring the controls as the airplane is flying in and calling for gear and flaps and those kinds of things. The other pilot is going to be monitoring the approach, and then as you get down to the transition level, we'll start to say, I'm going heads up, and we'll be looking outside. On a Cat 3, you're not going to see anything until you see the runway end lights and you touch the ground. So it's visibility. Category 2 is different.
Yep.
Because you will pick the things up and you'll fly the airplane down from a couple hundred feet.
Yeah, it's like 100 and something.
Yeah. So it depends on again, it depends on your personal limitations too, and how new you are to the airplane and those kinds of things. But we wanted to show you a little bit about how we went from in the 70s, which is what we're doing now, to what people are doing today with iPads and with glass cockpits. And in many cases, an iPad replaces a glass cockpit. You almost don't need to spend the tens and twenties and $40,000 worth of equipment in a GA airplane when you can do it all off an iPad.
And the airplanes now, the Cessna 172 is more advanced than this OV-10. But we have to remember, when we flew the OV-10, we flew almost all the aircraft that are here at the museum. This was before computers. So it was all hand flown and you had to figure it out. And so training became intense.
Yes.
To be able to actually do this in the real world. So, and now the simulator takes over, and now the training is more of, if you're doing a Cat 3 approach, what happens if it goes wrong?
Yes.
That's what we spend all our time in the simulator, is when it goes wrong, not when it goes right. So we just want, it was a really cool idea in keeping with the theme of instructors like we did on Saturday, is that both of us had to teach this stuff. And I'm telling you what, I don't know which is harder, learning it or teaching it, but man, it is a difficult thing to do.
Well, and it took a high level of precision to be able to fly these, and so you'd have to go out and practice them even when you didn't want to.
Oh, yes.
And with the airlines, it was always emergency procedures and approaches. And we used to have to do it twice a year, and we used to refer to that as you bet your job.
Yes, you bet your job, yes.
People would say, well, gee, it must be fun to fly those simulators. No, it wasn't fun at all.
Nothing goes right in a simulator.
Yeah, nothing. You never come out of it unbroken. It's always broken. Something is. And so, at any rate, we wanted to kind of enlighten you a little bit about instrument procedures and how they're flown and some of the equipment that's used. And Saturday, what we're planning to do is update you on the YF-16. I don't know if you saw the videos or not, because they were on Facebook. Our crew split the airplane. They cut the lady in half successfully. This week they have removed a lot of the internal structure that was there to add that 10-inch plug, and we think this weekend they're going to potentially put her back together. So we're going to do our deal as an update on a YF-16 on Saturday. So for Garry and myself, here at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home to the most touchable warbirds in Texas, we're open Saturdays from 9 until 2. We'd love to have you come out. The weather's good, and come on out and see us. Thanks, folks.
And you have to turn it off?
I will do that.
And we got a lot of